The kiss was fleeting but seismic, a spark that lit an entire forest on fire. Tom froze, his heart hammering in his chest, his mind grasping for sense in the chaos. Lauren's lips lingered just a second too long, as though daring him to react. The air in the small workshop seemed to thicken, heavy with the weight of the moment. Then came the creak. A sound so soft it could have been mistaken for the house settling, but to Tom, it roared like cannon fire. In the doorway stood Mary. Her shadow stretched into the room like an accusation, her expression carved from stone. It was the kind of silence that could make a guilty man confess without a word. Tom leapt back, his voice catching in his throat. Lauren stepped away too, her face flushed, her wide eyes darting to the floor like a guilty child caught red-handed. Mary! Tom's voice was a croak. He hadn't realized how much her name could weigh until now. Mary's gaze swept over the scene like a searchlight, assessing every detail. The way Tom's hand still hovered midair, the slight smudge of lipstick on his collar, the way Lauren shrank into the corner, clutching herself as if shielding against the inevitable fallout. But Mary didn't yell. She didn't cry or demand answers. She simply stood there for a moment, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly, and then turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing down the hall. The sound of her retreat hit harder than any scream could have. Tom bolted after her, stumbling into the kitchen as she calmly poured herself a cup of tea. She stirred the sugar in slow, deliberate circles, her face a mask of composure. "Mary, please let me explain," he started. But his words faltered when she set the spoon down with a sharp clink. "I don't think there's much to explain," she said, her tone eerily calm. "I saw enough." Tom opened his mouth to respond, but she raised a hand to stop him. "Not now," she added. "Let's not make a spectacle of this while Zach is still here." Her voice carried an edge sharp enough to slice through his excuses. Tom slumped into a chair, his head in his hands, as Mary quietly walked upstairs and closed the bedroom door behind her. The morning was a cacophony of forced smiles and stilted small talk. Lauren avoided everyone's gaze, her laughter from the night before replaced by nervous silence. Zach, oblivious to the tension, talked animatedly about his poker game, but his jokes fell flat in the strained air. Mary moved through the motions of breakfast with unnerving efficiency, her face unreadable. Tom, on the other hand, could barely lift his fork, his appetite replaced by a gnawing sense of dread. Lauren excused herself early, mumbling something about packing the car. As Zach helped Lauren load her bags, Tom caught Mary's eye. For a brief second, her mask slipped, and he saw the storm brewing beneath. It wasn't anger, it was something far worse. It was the look of someone who had been betrayed not just by her husband, but by the very fabric of their shared life. When the front door closed behind Zach and Lauren, the silence was suffocating. Tom stood in the living room, gripping the edge of the sofa as if it could anchor him. Mary walked in, her footsteps soft but purposeful. She didn't sit. Instead, she leaned against the doorframe, her arms crossed. "Well," she said, breaking the silence, "you certainly made this weekend memorable." "Mary, Tom began, but she cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Don't," she snapped, her voice cracking for the first time. "Just don't. Not now." Her composure wavered, just for a moment, and Tom felt the weight of what he'd done crash down on him. But before he could utter another word, she steadied herself. "You need to decide what kind of man you are, Tom," she said, her voice trembling but resolute, "before someone else decides for you." With that, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving Tom standing there, his world collapsing around him. But Mary wasn't retreating into despair. Upstairs, she picked up her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed a number she hadn't called in years. When the voice on the other end answered, her own voice was steady. "I need a favor," she said, glancing out the window at the gazebo. "It's time we had a conversation about Tom." Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves like a warning. Tom sat alone in the dim living room, the shadows of the past night looming large. Upstairs, Mary's quiet determination set something in motion that would soon make the events of the previous night feel like mere tremors before the earthquake. The house settled into an uneasy silence after Zach and Lauren drove off, their car a fading hum down the suburban street. Tom sat at the kitchen table, staring into his coffee as though the answer to everything lay somewhere in the dark liquid's swirling surface. He replayed the previous night in his mind, trying to convince himself that it wasn't as catastrophic as it felt. It was a mistake, a stupid, fleeting moment. But Mary's voice echoed in his head. You need to decide what kind of man you are. Upstairs, Mary sat on the edge of their bed, the phone still in her hand. The person on the other end of the line had listened patiently, their occasional hums of acknowledgement soothing but non-committal. She spoke in a measured tone, her emotions tightly controlled. I'm not looking to humiliate him, she said finally, but I won't be made a fool of either. Understood, the voice replied. I'll handle it discreetly. She hung up and sat still for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the framed photo of her and Tom from their 50th wedding anniversary. In the picture, they were smiling, their arms wrapped around each other in the kind of embrace that spoke of decades of shared history. But now, the man in that photo felt like a stranger. Later that day, Tom retreated to his workshop, desperate for the familiar comfort of his tools and projects. He couldn't bring himself to face Mary, so he spent hours sanding a piece of wood for the gazebo, even though it didn't need sanding. His hands moved automatically, but his mind churned. He couldn't shake the memory of Lauren's touch, the thrill it had ignited. A thrill he hadn't felt in years. But beneath that fleeting rush was a deeper pit of guilt and shame. He was startled when Mary appeared in the doorway, her expression as unreadable as ever. Dinner's ready, she said simply. Tom nodded, muttering his thanks. He followed her into the dining room, where the table was set with her usual precision. The meal was quiet, save for the clinking of silverware. Finally, Mary spoke. I made a call this morning, she said, her voice steady. Tom's fork hovered midair. A call? Yes, she replied, meeting his eyes for the first time that day. To an old friend. Someone who knows how to help people figure out their messes. Tom frowned, the words landing like a lead weight. What does that mean? Mary leaned back in her chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap. It means I'm not going to sit here and let this situation fester. We've been through too much, Tom. I've been through too much. He swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. Mary, Don't, she interrupted, her tone sharp. Not yet. You had your moment of weakness, Tom. Now it's time for you to see the consequences. Before he could press further, the doorbell rang. Mary stood, her movements brisk and purposeful. Tom followed her to the door, his unease growing with each step. When she opened it, he was stunned to see a tall man in his mid-40s standing on the porch, his crisp suit and leather briefcase at odds with the casual neighborhood. He extended a hand. Tom, the man said warmly, it's a pleasure to meet you. I'm Elliot Hayes, a mediator. Tom blinked, his confusion deepening. Mediator? What? Come in, Elliot, Mary said, her tone polite but firm. She stepped aside to let him enter, then turned to Tom. We're going to have a conversation, Tom. An honest one. Tom's stomach churned. A mediator? Mary, what are you doing? I'm giving us a chance to address this, she replied evenly, before it becomes something we can't come back from. Elliot set his briefcase on the coffee table and opened it, pulling out a notebook and pen. He gestured for them to sit. Tom hesitated but eventually sank into the armchair across from Mary. She sat on the couch, her posture straight and composed. Elliot began, his voice calm and measured. This isn't about blame. It's about understanding where things went wrong and what you both want moving forward. Tom bristled. I don't need a stranger to tell me how to talk to my wife. Mary's eyes flashed. Clearly you do. Elliot raised a hand, diffusing the tension. Let's start simple. Tom, what were you feeling last night when the incident happened? Tom flushed, the weight of his actions pressing on him. It was, I don't know. I felt flattered, I guess. Lauren. She made me feel alive again. Mary's jaw tightened, but she didn't interrupt. Elliot nodded. And Mary, how did you feel when you saw them? Mary exhaled slowly. Like I was watching my entire life unravel in front of me. I've spent decades holding this family together, building a life with this man. And in one moment, it felt like none of it mattered to him. Tom's head shot up. That's not true, Mary. Of course it matters. Does it? She countered, her voice rising for the first time. Because from where I was standing, it looked like you'd thrown it all away for a fleeting thrill. Elliot stepped in. This is good. Honesty is the first step. Tom buried his face in his hands, his voice muffled. I didn't mean for it to happen. It was stupid, and I hate myself for it. Mary leaned forward, her tone softer now. Tom, I don't need your guilt. I need to know if you're still the man I built my life with, or if I've been lying to myself all these years. The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging heavy. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. Tom looked at Mary, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and resolve. I don't know, he admitted quietly, but I want to find out. Elliot closed his notebook with a decisive snap. That's a start. But as Tom and Mary sat in that room, staring at the fractures in their once solid life, neither of them realized that Lauren wasn't done shaking their world. Across town, she sat in her car, her hands trembling as she scrolled through the photos on her phone. The evidence she carried could destroy everything, or set a chain reaction no one could predict. The first cracks in Tom and Mary's fragile truce came just 3 days later, on a rainy Wednesday evening. The rain pelted against the windows, a relentless drumbeat that only heightened the tension brewing inside their home. Tom sat at the kitchen table, staring at the plate of untouched dinner in front of him. Mary was across the room, tidying up with an almost militant efficiency. The silence between them was suffocating. Then came the knock at the door. It was hesitant at first, as if the person on the other side wasn't entirely sure they wanted to be there. Tom and Mary exchanged a wary glance before Mary wiped her hands on a dish towel and walked to the door. When she opened it, her breath caught. Lauren stood there, soaked from the rain, her mascara smudged and her eyes wild. Clutched in her hand was her phone, its screen illuminated. I'm sorry, Lauren stammered, her voice trembling. I didn't know where else to go. Tom rose from his chair, his pulse quickening. Lauren, what are you doing here? Mary stepped aside, her expression unreadable, and Lauren stepped inside, dripping water onto the hardwood floor. She glanced nervously at Mary before turning to Tom. I made a mistake, Lauren began, her voice cracking. I thought I could just walk away from this, but I can't. Tom's stomach dropped. What are you talking about? Lauren held up her phone, and the images on the screen made Tom's blood run cold. They were photos of the two of them in the workshop, the stolen kiss, the way their bodies had leaned toward each other as if magnetized. She scrolled to a short video clip that captured the moment in heart-wrenching clarity. I don't know how it happened, Lauren said, tears streaming down her face. I swear I didn't record it. My phone was on the workbench, and I guess it must have caught everything. Tom felt the room tilt beneath him. Lauren, you need to delete that. Now. Lauren shook her head, her voice rising in panic. I tried, but it's already been backed up to the cloud. And... She hesitated, biting her lip. And what? Mary's voice was calm but cold, her eyes boring into Lauren. And Zach knows, Lauren whispered. Tom staggered back as if he'd been punched. What? Lauren nodded, her tears falling faster now. He found it on my phone. He confronted me last night. I didn't know what to say, so I told him the truth. Tom sank into a chair, his head in his hands. Oh God! Mary, on the other hand, stood as still as a statue, her expression betraying nothing. "And where is Zach now?" she asked evenly. Lauren hesitated. He's at his apartment. He said he needed time to think." Mary nodded slowly, as if she'd already expected this answer. Then she turned to Lauren, her voice sharp. "Go home, Lauren. Whatever happens next, it's not your place to be here." Lauren looked at Tom, her eyes pleading. But when he said nothing, she nodded and left without another word. The sound of the door closing behind her was like a gunshot. For a long moment, Mary and Tom were alone in the silence. Then Mary spoke, her voice eerily calm. "How long were you planning on telling me the whole truth?" Tom looked up, his face pale. "Mary, Don't," she snapped, cutting him off. "Don't lie to me. Not now. Did you think this was going to go away? That I wouldn't find out?" Tom's shoulders sagged. I thought it was just a moment. A stupid mistake. I didn't think it would come to this." Mary laughed bitterly. "Of course you didn't. You never think, Tom. You just do." Her words sliced through him, and for a moment he was speechless. Then he stood, his voice rising. "I know I screwed up, Mary. You think I don't know that? I've been drowning in guilt since it happened." "Good," Mary snapped. "You should drown in it, because that's exactly what you've done to this family." Tom opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, his phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen and felt his heart stop. It was Zach. Mary saw the name too. "Well?" she said, crossing her arms. "Are you going to answer it?" Tom hesitated for a fraction of a second before picking up the phone. "Zach," he said, his voice trembling. "Son, I don't want to hear it, Grandpa," Zach interrupted, his tone icy. "I just wanted to let you know that I'm done. Done with you, done with this family. Don't bother calling me again." The line went dead before Tom could respond. He stared at the phone in his hand, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Mary watched him for a long moment, her expression softening ever so slightly. "Well," she said finally, "I hope it was worth it." The words hit Tom like a freight train. He sank back into the chair, his head in his hands. Mary stood there for a moment longer, then turned and walked upstairs, leaving him alone in the suffocating silence. But the final blow came the next morning, when Mary sat across from him at the breakfast table and slid a set of papers toward him. "I called the mediator," she said quietly, "and the lawyer. I'm filing for separation." Tom looked up, his eyes filled with tears. "Mary, please." "No," she said firmly. "Not this time." As she walked out the door, Tom realized the truth. He hadn't just betrayed her trust. He'd lost the one person who had always believed in him, and he had no one to blame but himself.